Welcome back to War Thunder, and before I begin with anything else, I might give you a recommendation. This video is taking way over an hour. It's a very long video, and it might not be perfectly edited because of the different sound files that I used, which will come in a moment, but you might use it as a podcast. So search on Google, for example, YouTube to MP3, and there will a converter appear to which you will just insert the address or the link of this video, and then you can download for yourself. Feel free to do so. And yeah, today I have a very special guest, which is ManyMilesAway. Before I come to the part where I talk to ManyMilesAway, I want to tell you that I am very interested in your opinion afterwards, and let me know in the comment section what you think about it. Also, I wanted to do this kind of video for a very long time. Why? Well, because when I firstly got in contact with some YouTubers, it was actually on the Gentleman's Hangar TeamSpeak, which is now no longer, sadly. And at this place, I learned people like Squireflyer, like The Orange Doom, and Max, and also Michael's Booms, and many more. And so, yeah, I always had this kind of idea, but I never came around to do it. Also, it was kind of, very good that I didn't do it because I needed some experience with YouTube, with editing, more experience with the game, and also to bring things into perspective. And now I think it's a good time that I finally begin with it. So the funny part with ManyMilesAway, which is my first guest, so to speak, is that we actually did this kind of very often. I often, wrote to him, hey, I have a question about this tank or that thing, or what do you think about this? And we often ended up on his Discord and went into a room and we talked, and it was like just 1 or 2 minutes, just answering the question, and it very often ended up with us talking like 15, 30 minutes, an hour, or even 2, and afterwards we were always like, damn it, we should have recorded this. And so this time I just said, okay, you know what, next week Monday we record this, okay, and we just prepare a little bit by just looking through the tech trees, making some notes or something like this. It ended up with me taking no notes at all and just talking about the stuff, how it came along. We actually didn't practice this, so if there is maybe 1 or 2 seconds gaps before the other one is beginning to talk, I hope you don't mind. Just let me know in the comment section afterwards what you think about it. And yeah, without further ado, let's get straight into it. So, hello Miles, how are you?
I'm doing well.
So that's good. Today, as I mentioned, maybe in the intro, I don't know, we want to talk about German tanks. We want to talk about the problem that German tanks have, and that is the lack of mobility. So, as you can see, Germany has a lot of good tanks by themselves if you compare them 1-to-1 versus other tanks, and you might not really see where the problem for German tankers come from. Now, there is always people that say that German tankers are bad, and there are certainly people out there that are not perfectly capable of playing the game because they lack the experience and have not every vehicle fully upgraded. But it's not such a big excuse throughout the thousands of players and also the experienced players when they just have not a chance against certain nations and just get steamrolled. My approach towards is to point out the lack of mobility. And I had a quick look into the German tech tree. We have basically no compensation for the gain of mobility for other nations. And the only other nation that really suffers somewhat together with the Germans are the British. However, the British still have a lot of advantages that kind of bypass this problem, and they artificially can up-tier certain tanks, for example such as the Comet in a tier 4 or even tier 5 game where its mobility is still very comparable. So yeah, what do you think about this intro?
I think it's okay. Are we just jumping right into the discussion?
Yes, let's just see how it goes and what each other's opinion is. and what we can do about it, and what other nations have kind of an advantage and so forth. So do you share this experience when you play the game, like you're playing the Germans, and what do you think is, in your opinion, the greatest problem?
I tend to agree with the idea that the Germans lack flexibility. The overall issue that I find with the German teams is not necessarily that their players are bad. I don't think that their players are really that much worse than any other nation. I think it's down to a couple of other factors as well. It's a lack of good team composition. It's a lack of mobility for the German teams because of that team composition. And it's also the large amount of power creep that has occurred over the last couple of years when it comes to new vehicles being added to other nations, but the Germans not getting properly compensated to deal with them. It used to be about a year and a half ago, when the Germans were very, very good, that the thing that made the Germans so good at that tier was that they had something that could counter just about anything. They had mobility in the form of the Panther II, which was better than any medium tank in the game at the time. Of course, this was before the M46 had EFS. This was before a lot of the recoilless rifle-armed vehicles were in the game. And this was before a lot of the high-penetration heat rounds were starting to trickle their way down to Tier 4. And the Germans really, really had a good lineup down here at Tier 4, where they seemed to struggle the most in moving into Tier 5. But like I said, there's those three factors. There's a lack of good composition because there's no mobility, and on top of that, the power creep are the two biggest issues that I can see.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about certain tanks, such as, for example, the FE-4202, when it first got introduced, it was kind of such a meh tank, and then it just got buffed. And when we think about it, it has really trollish armor. It always had it. It always had the 20-pounder, but later on, the stabilizer got added, and also a PDS. And I played the tank myself, and I found myself mostly against Tigers. And I'm sorry, but a Tiger really, really struggles to face this tank in a head-on engagement. It has problems with, pointing the gun on target, penetrating the target, and also doing enough damage even if you penetrate the target, whereas the 20-pounder just makes short work even after the first penetration. And that's just the Tiger. The same goes for the Panthers, and, well, they are by themselves not really bad tanks. Another issue are the maps, in my opinion. German tanks do not really well in a corner fight, in a street fight, because they just lack the maneuverability, the agility to just peek around the corner and reverse. In theory, it's not that bad, but if somebody is prepared, you always eat that penetration and you're combat inefficient. And the old myth, the German tanks, for example, to go back to the Panther, Tiger, and Tiger II, where they just excel at long range. We barely have that in the game. We have this probably on Kursk, we have this maybe on Fulda, and also on the Maginot Line map. However, the spawns and where the people usually go and where they can go before they get shot in the side, and also where the objectives are, do not support this kind of playstyle, this long-range dominance. Because there is always one, for example, for the Russians, a potato truck that rushes into a cap, drives around, doesn't get killed, and then just captures the point. And then which tank should go there to decap it or to even recap it? And this is again a lack of mobility for the Germans. And this is where the RE251 comes in, where it has a good mobility, has a powerful gun. It still kind of lacks the stabilizer if you compare it with the British, and also the rate of fire, but it has a good heat shell, and it's a premium tank. So you cannot really expect from every player to buy an RE251 just to have a completely competitive lineup. And so every other nation, especially the Americans, which were in the beginning a very mediocre nation that nobody really played so far, now is one of the most trollish nations that there is, especially at 6.7, which is just a prime example if you think about it. The M56 Scorpion, T92, M50 Ontos, T114, they're all at 6.7, where they also have tanks such as the T29 or even the Super Hellcat at 6.3. So this entire area is really, really good for the Americans. And you can actually see that power creep that we just talked about, even within the American tech tree. I mean, just a simple question. How is a 26E11, aka the Super Pershing, how does it deserve the same battle rating as the a T34 heavy tank or the T29 premium tank? It just doesn't fit together. And the T20 or the Super Pershing, when it first came out, nobody took it too serious because it actually was no power creep. And when we now go back to Germany, they never got anything added to their lineup that is in any way, shape or form an absolute killer tank. The addition of the Tiger 2H SLA 16 was more or less just a copy-paste version of the Tiger 2. Much like the IS-2 Revenge when it came out. It was a good addition, it was a premium tank, and people enjoyed it. So, kind of another point that I just want to add on before I ramble too much. The Tiger 2 also got nerfed with the addition of the fuel tanks on the bottom of the tank exploding on a regular basis, which before the introduction of the T29 they rarely did. And so the Tiger 2 got power creeped, got ripped apart its flanking support or fast support with the Panther 2, and it also got nerfed with the addition of the fuel tank exploding. So Germany, once being the pride at 6.7 and being the gold standard, is now, well, left with barely anything. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree to a certain extent. I do want to clarify that the German vehicles themselves are still incredibly capable. The issue themselves, I don't think, is the vehicles in the German tech tree by any means. The German vehicles are some of the best in their class. The problem is that it's only in their class, and the other vehicles that the Allies have been getting, the T-29, T-34, are perfect examples of this, I think. The T-34 and the T-29 were both designed with the express purpose of taking on King Tiger and Panther. And as a result, they destroy King Tiger and Panther on a relatively efficient basis. On top of that, like you mentioned, there are also a few other subclasses of vehicles, such as the M56 Scorpion, these fast little light tank destroyers that pack an incredible punch for their size. T114 is also a perfect example of this, that will just kill King Tigers from the front without any real difficulty. And that's more down to using post-war, Cold War era ammunition against World War II vehicles, which you can argue all day whether or not that's fair. But at the same time, the Germans are not exactly being helped by the fact that the RU-251 is really their only option at this point for any sort of real mobility, and it's not exactly a great one either. All of the other nations that can flank or that have very good flankers like light tanks and so on, all have the capabilities to really kill in one shot. The RU-251 is not so much one of those vehicles, especially because it only has a Heat FS round. The Heat FS round is great if you're punching through the front plate of a T-95 tank destroyer, but it's not all that great if you are running up against the side armor of T-29s and so on, which have which have large tracks covering their side armor, and it makes it kind of tricky to destroy them. On top of that, like you also mentioned, the maps and the game modes especially, I think, are a huge issue with War Thunder. There's been very little development there, and from the beginning, the Germans are very much a sort of standoffish nation. They're very much a defensive-oriented nation. They're not an aggressive nation by the time we get to Tier 4. Early on in like Tier 2 and Tier 3, you can kind of make it work. But Tier 4, at that point, the Germans were on the defensive in World War II, and a lot of these vehicles are very, very much better in defensive roles and defensive capabilities where the enemy comes to them. Unfortunately, because of the way that the game modes are set up in War Thunder, that is not allowed to happen. If you do that, you're going to lose. And it's that simple. Because if you don't take the cap circles, you don't rush forward, you don't attack, then you're losing. It's quite that simple. And it's a really, really poor way of encouraging people to play these vehicles in the manner that they're supposed to be. There are a couple of game modes where they can, and those are Break and Battle. And Break is nice because while there is one side of a map where you can attack, the other side of the map you can defend. And if you defend that side of the map and you defend your objectives, then the enemy can't necessarily win. You have to either take the enemy's objectives to secure a victory, or the enemy has to take yours. And if you've got a lot of King Tigers or Jagdpanthers or Ferdinands sitting at long range, picking off enemies as they come in, that becomes something that's very, very difficult to fight for pretty much any of the allies. Yeah, they have some tools to deal with it, like some vehicles have ATGMs, but most vehicles don't. And only a couple of vehicles here and there really have the capabilities to deal with a well-prepared defensive position set up by the Germans.
Yeah.
But again, the current game modes like Domination and Conquest, which are the predominant game modes right now, don't allow for that. And they actively punish that playstyle. And we see this in other nations too. A perfect example of this is the Conqueror heavy tank. The Conqueror is not a particularly good tank in War Thunder because, well, the Conqueror relies on a purely defensive playstyle in order for it to do well. And it doesn't. Now, that's also in combination with the APDS and HESH nerfs that have come in over the last few updates. That have come to light over the last few updates. But that's a completely different discussion. But again, the point still stands that the Conqueror and all of these other defensive-oriented tanks really suffer because of the way the game modes are laid out within War Thunder, and that can't be helping either.
Yeah. One other thing that we have to talk about when we talk about kind of how the tech tree evolved is Germany was more and more about firepower. I mean, we have very powerful tank destroyers, open-topped, lightly armored, but powerful guns. I mean, the Marder 3 at 2.7, I mean, if that barrel aims at you, you're already dead, you just don't know it yet. Same goes for the 88 Flak 37, Dicker Max, Nashorn, Waffenträger, Krupp Steyr, Sture Emil. They are very, very powerful, and they just have so ridiculously big guns that fit on tanks, a battle rating above or even higher. And when they have something in their sight, they can punch it really, really hard. But the problem is to get those tanks into a position and also to survive there. The next thing is, from a game's point, is the spawn point battle. And this is very, very much a problem. For example, if you look at Germany, they just don't have any light tank that can also scout. Again, with the exception of the RE251 or the first tech tree tank that can do it, the big light Panzer 57 at 8.7, which is also heavily up-tiered or too over-tiered, let's put it that way. And it is a fun vehicle sometimes to play, but to rely on this vehicle is a something completely different matter. The next thing is that just enemy light tanks, for example the new French line, is a perfect addition. They don't have a lot of armor, but they have powerful guns, and in the shape of the MX-13 SS-11 they also have rockets if you really need to deal with something. 600 millimeters of penetration at 6.7 is actually not power creep, because we have the same in the British tech tree with the Stritzwagen 81. However, it's also the case that with the MX-13 you can spot, you can capture a point, against the Germans in particular. You can win the light tank battle because you mostly have superior numbers, even in the tech tree. You have an entire dedicated light tank line, much like the Japanese, you know, I mean, the Japanese tech tree is full of American light tanks that can also spot throughout the tiers. And the next thing is, if you die and you have achieved already something, it's much easier to get into a plane. And that brings us to the next point, and that is air superiority. The French are again somewhat of a blessed nation because they have a lot of American planes, F6, F5, F6, F5, 5N, and P63C5, Bearcat, 84, fantastic planes to not just bomb the living hell out of enemy tanks, especially early on where they can never go back into the game, because if a heavy tank gets bombed before he can do anything, that player is just gone. And this is kind of a domino effect. But also the German planes have a really damn hard time taking on enemy tanks, even if they manage to get a plane in the air. And as much as I love, for example, the Duck or all the cannon casts, it's highly situational. The enemy teams also have very capable SPA players, and you never can survive long enough against a Spitfire or a Bearcat or even an 84 Skyraider. And that is just my expertise. Also, the bomb load of the German fighters is not as great as, for example, the American or hell, even the British one. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The German close air support is severely lacking in terms of staying power. They unless you're armed with cannons, like on the Dornier 335 B2 or the HE219, which are both premiums, by the way. I mean, and there is some tech tree versions of those vehicles, but they don't have anywhere near the ammo count needed in order to stick around. The German cannon cast, while effective, the higher the tier you go, the more difficult it gets to survive. Especially because the Allied aircraft get a lot of fighter bombers, whereas the Germans have a lot of dedicated ground attack aircraft which don't double as fighters. Now, is that historically accurate? Sure. The Germans always did struggle with a close air support aircraft from the mid to late war period. However, what that also translates into in game is that the Germans really don't have anything that can come in, drop some ordnance on some poor hapless bastards and tanks, and then stick around long enough and continue to support the team. There are, I mean, I've got the 262 Sturmvogel, and the Sturmvogel is an event aircraft. It's very rare. You don't see it too much. It's an exception rather than the rule. Whereas, how many P-47s do the Americans get? Like 6?
A lot of them.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, and that's not even counting stuff like the Bearcat, which has a really, really good bomb load. The P-61 has a really, really good bomb load. The P-63 has a really good bomb load. The P-51s, for crying out loud, can carry 2 1,000-pounders. I mean, it's not... The Americans, the British, they're not lacking for close air support. The French especially. It's especially the 1,000-pound bombs or the 500-kilogram bombs, where bombs get really effective. And the Germans very often have to deal with 250-kilogram bombs, for example, on the Bf-109s. If they can carry bombs at all, it's like 50-kilogram bombs, which you have to really lay under the enemy tank, and he has to stand still. And, otherwise you would blow up yourself. Stovepipe.
Pardon?
You practically have to shove it right into the exhaust pipe in order to kill them with one of those. So
yeah, and for example, what really annoys the hell out of me is I got the Packwagen, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234-4. It's a battle rating 3.0. It has a ridiculous powerful gun for that battle rating, somewhat a nice mobility as a wielded combat vehicle, but it struggles to get up slopes and so forth. But you still can achieve God of War, and you can flank enemies. And what I noticed by excessively driving it was that a lot of people, when they knew that they are fighting Germans, they just lost their mind and gave up any kind of flanking security, and you just could farm them for days up until the point that a plane got in your vicinity and strafed you with machine guns, cannons, or rockets, which are still effective, by the way. And again, this tank is an event vehicle, so Gaijin actually effectively removed this vehicle from being introduced into the normal tech tree, which indicates for me that Gaijin really hates to give the Germans any kind of mobility. Same with the Panzer IIH. It got popular for a reason. It's something German with mobility, got removed from the store. And so kind of we see a pattern emerging. Everything that the Germans get, even as premiums, is rather slow. With the exception of, again, the MKPZ M47, which is a standalone German 7.3 battle rating tank. And again, it's premium.
Yeah, the elements that the Germans should have in terms of getting like extra mobility or getting like extra firepower in a frontal engagement, or all of these improvements are being added to the Allies in their normal tech trees, but the Germans are only getting in rare event vehicles or in premiums. They're not getting any real compensation for the average player who's not going to go out and spend $50 on an M47, or he's not going to have all of these premium vehicles available to him. He's maybe going to have 2 or 3 at most.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you feel really generous, maybe a little bit more than that. People don't have that kind of money to throw around on a regular basis normally. Yeah. And as a result, it really seems to hurt the Germans later, like the farther and farther on you get, especially in the fact that they have no light tanks past tier 2.
Yeah.
Like that's it. It goes up to there and stops. And
yeah.
I think introducing vehicles like the RU-251 as a premium was a huge mistake. I think everybody can pretty much agree on that one. That vehicle should be basically a tier 5 vehicle in the normal tech tree, not a tier 4 premium by any means.
Yeah, maybe even 7.3 or 7.0. And that brings us to another funny topic. I mean, it's not like the Germans don't have anything mobile after like tier 4. There are people that suggest that tier 4 for Germany is dead. But it takes an awful amount of grinding to go through it and to actually grind then with tier 3 vehicles or tier 4 premium vehicles, if you spend the money on the game, to unlock a tier 5 vehicle, and especially a lineup that is capable of carrying itself. And then you have cases like the Jagdpanzer 45 Hanomag Henschel, which has APCR as a stock shell and doesn't have a turret, unlike the RE251, which is basically the basis for it, which has a lower battle rating and a turret and a heat shell by default because it's premium. And so we also see the Raketenjagdpanzer 2s. Yes, somewhat mobile, but again, pretty vulnerable, and they're one-trick ponies. They don't have armor like the IT-1, or they don't have the kind of firing from really strange awkward angles like some of the British ATGMs, which are also not the best in the game, to be honest. And then also the Leopard, way too slow, horrible stock grind. And while the Leopard 1 now has kind of a better meta together with the mouse, because you're very often top tier at 7.7, it's really it's not nice to play it stock, let's put it that way.
Yeah, the Germans at later tier 5 are better, but they're not. It's still not ideal for the reasons we mentioned earlier. There are a couple of things that can be done, however, to really improve the German situation. Number one, get the Panther II out of 7.0 and drop it down to 6.7. The only reason the Panther II was moved up to 7.0 back in the day was because there wasn't any other competitive 6.7 medium tanks for the other nations. The Americans had the M46, but it didn't have its really, really high penetration heat FS round yet. They didn't have the M56 Scorpion. They didn't have the T114. They didn't have the Ontos. They didn't have all of these like fast little flanking vehicles that had shit tons of penetration available to them. The Panther II was really the only thing the Germans had even remotely akin to a light tank at 6.7. That was actually competitive and good. And if you think about it, other than the mobility, the Panther II is worse or the same in every single way to a Tiger II. There is, other than the mobility, there is no other advantage that the Panther II has over the Tiger II. The Tiger II turret traverses faster. It's got way better armor. It's got the same gun, the same rate of fire. I mean, the only thing that the Panther II has over the Tiger II is mobility. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, the Panther II is not a bad vehicle. It's fun to play, and it got really, really popular. Maybe that was the problem, especially the combination of the Panther II and the Horton. And oh look, wasn't the HVAC belt removed for the Horton as of late? So Gaijin, it looks very much like Gaijin wants to bury Germany. And there are people that say, yeah, Germany is still the very best nation, and it's just the bad players. But then, that mostly comes from players that play other nations, especially the British, which just troll around with their APDS stabilizer, high rate of fire, and trollish armor in the shape of the FV4 202, the Centurion Mark III, and also the Mark 10, and also the Carnarvon, and so forth. So those are really, really capable tanks, which are also capable of up-tiering lower tier vehicles with decent mobility, such as, for example, the Cromwell or the Comet or the Iron Duke, which is also an event vehicle, which is basically a copy and paste thing of the Comet, so no harm there. Then they just have really fantastic tanks all around, I guess. And with the recent AP buff, even the stock grind got durable and endurable, let's put it that way. And their air superiority and the anti-cast that the fighters just pose is just amazing. The next thing for Germany is that, well, the nation that could have heavily supported Germany, Japan, got removed in terms of being bound to play with Germany. Sometimes you face the Japanese, and what do they get? Well, do I really have to tell you about the Hori prototype and the production, which are basically better Ferdinands with better mobility and awesome guns? So, and they also kind of have the light tanks that could support Germany. And their planes really drive the last nail into the German cast.
Right. I mean, at low out, the Japanese fighters, some of them, not the Ki-87 that I'm looking at here, but even stuff like the A6M5 Co are just dominating at low altitude. If you can get these things into a low altitude dogfight, the Japanese will just wipe the floor with anybody. It doesn't matter if you're in a space fire or a Bearcat or something like that. If you get a zero into a low altitude turn fight, which is generally in what most fights devolve into in ground RB, the Japanese will just run away with victories. Just kill after kill after kill after kill. The only thing that holds them back is their limited ammo capacity on their cannons. Now, some of the later war Japanese fighters tend to be more geared towards anti-bomber roles. However, even the anti-bomber fighters can still hold their own. And the German fighters just either tend to get heavier and heavier and heavier as they're being pressed into the anti-bomber role as well, because historically Germany is being bombed into fucking oblivion. But again, there's nothing there that the Germans can bring, really, to stay competitive in terms of keeping their CAS alive at higher tiers, which again compounds the problem that they had earlier of the CAS isn't very good in the first place, and then on top of that, they can't keep themselves alive long enough to make a real difference. At least not at higher tiers. At mid tiers, sure, they can get away with it, but at high tiers, not so much.
Yeah, well, about the Japanese planes, I mean, you just have to name a few leaders of the lines, and everybody that flies an Allied plane just shakes in fear of N1Ks, Ki-84s in various different variants. Nobody really has the balls to contest the Zeros in a low level dogfight. A7M1 as one of the best premiums in the game. Hell, even the B7A2 as a bomber can drop it bombs and just gives most of the American and some of the British fighters also a good run for their money. They can hold themselves. But what the Japanese then lack is also the CAS potential. They have a really poor CAS potential. The B7A2 is one of the best CAS that they got, and it just has one 800 kilogram bomb. Maybe the Key 43-3 can carry two 250 kilogram bombs, but again, there are not 500 kilogram bombs, where really the border is between barely effective and very effective. And yeah, then also, well, shall we talk about Italy? They have no CAS whatsoever, and they are not really implemented as a tank nation either. So the only Axis nation for ground forces that there is in War Thunder currently is, for all intents and purposes, Germany. And they just got kind of nerfed and held back in every way possible. And when you say that on the internet, especially on some of my videos, people just tend to disagree with me, to say it politely. And a very, very well-known sentence is, yeah, just get good and learn to play. And I just really despise that.
Well, I mean, it's not... The fact of the matter is that it's no longer an issue of get good, learn to play. If it was simply that, then the Germans would be doing just fine. Like, they wouldn't have the lowest win rates of any nation in the game. Like... When a nation has when a nation as powerful as Germany should be, has the lowest win rates of any nation in the game, there is something wrong there. I mean, and that is not simply just a get good, learn to play. And that's again, like you mentioned earlier, that comes from a lot of Allied players just wanting to continue their ruffle stomping of the Germans. Now, on the flip side of that, the German players themselves should realize that they are no longer going to be top dogs. It doesn't matter what changes occur to the Germans. They are not going to be the best nation in the game anymore. That is just simply not possible. However, they should be doing better than what they are, or than what they are doing currently. And that comes down to a few things. Adding in more light tanks for the Germans at Tier 4, giving them some greater flanking capabilities with the Panther II, dropping that down to 6.7. I think right before we started, I also mentioned that the 10.5cm Tiger II would be a perfect 6.7 candidate. Now, I know a lot of people are going to cringe at that. However, if you look at the T-29, it's effectively a perfect counterpart to a T-29. The T-29 has way better turret armor, but pretty poor hull armor. And the 10.5cm Tiger II is one of the few things that will punch right through the upper front plate of a T-29/T-34. On top of that, the T-29 or the King Tiger 105 does enormous damage with a single shot, and the reload on it is way slower. The other thing to take into account is that the horsepower has gone up significantly. You've gone from 700 horsepower engine to a 900 horsepower engine. So the 10.5cm Tiger II can get around much better. It's far more... It can react faster. It's far more mobile. And dropping this thing down to 6.7 and dropping the Panther II with it, maybe even dropping... Hell, I'll say it. Drop the M47 down to 7.0. And make that sort of like the de facto like first tier 5 medium tank. The Panther II deserves to be 6.7. It's no better than a King Tiger, other than the mobility. And in terms of the Tiger II 10.5, it's practically on par. There's no reason why the Germans can't have these two vehicles at 6.7 and make them more common on the battlefield. If you make them more common, people are going to play them more, and on top of the sheer potential that these vehicles have, they would offer some real flexibility to the Germans without even having to add any new vehicles. That's not even counting some of the possible light tank additions or some of the medium tank additions from places like Switzerland, in the form of like the Panzer 58 or the Panzer 61, which are basically developments of the German Indian Panzer project. And think of it as kind of like a transitional vehicle between a Panther 2 and a Leopard 1. You drop most of the armor. You go down like 120 millimeters of hull armor at best, or something like that. The turret armor isn't very well protected. Yeah. It's kind of like an M48 turret.
Talking about... Yeah, sorry, but we also have to talk here about the player base. And this is now very interesting. And this is, I guess, somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you think about it. So the German tanks get less competitive. So the competitive thinking tankers just say, okay, why should I still play the Germans? They lose more games than I'd like to, and I cannot rely on those teams or even the tanks. So a lot of people that are very good with what they can do in a single tank, they just switch the nation and they play the flavor of the month. I mean, look at the French when they got introduced, how many players played them. And, there are the better players that understand the game mechanics, that try out different things, that play very aggressively, but retreat if they have to. They also use cash way better. They very often have fully upgraded vehicles. They just spend more gold on the game, which is, desirable for a Gaijin, I guess. They need to make money somehow. And there is nothing wrong with that, but it's the way that they do it. And I mean, when the Tiger 2 first came out, the SLA 16, everybody was hyped about it. Yeah, and it's so much better than the regular Tiger, which I think was not really justified. But maybe there was some soft stats that because I didn't play it at the time. Then the T29 took over this flavor of the month role. And, with the special lower plate bug, let's call it that. And then later on, the IS-6, which needs no further introduction. So the players jump to them. And if you give a very, very good, borderline overpowered vehicle to a very good player, guess what he does to an inferior vehicle that is driven by a less capable tanker. And then, it's easy to point at Germany that never got any sort of a really shiny tank at their disposal that is really capable of racking up the kills, surviving the return fire, and still keep on fighting, and just lose game after game because of all the mentioned issues, and then just say, yeah, German players are bad. Because the only players that are kind of left are those for Germany that want to get over the stock grind or want to grind through maybe the shiny top tier tanks such as the KPZ-70, Raketenjagdpanzer 2 Hot, maybe Begleitpanzer or Flakpanzer Gepard, and they hope for the best that those tanks are then capable of doing the job, and so they endure the pain of grinding through. But very often also the players leave the game before they actually have lost all their spawn points, because they think at this point in time it's just a waste of time to jump into a Coelian or even a Kugelblitz, Ostwind, something like that, and to keep on trying, because there are too many aircraft in the air, there are too many tanks already going for your spawn zone and just spawn camp you, and that's just deeply frustrating, and it keeps on going like that, game after game after game. And it's just heartbreaking for me to admit it. The best thing that I ever did was to not play the Germans for a while.
Right. I mean, again, like I was saying earlier, the solutions to this problem don't have to be complicated. They're very, very simple. Reduce the battle ratings of a couple of vehicles. Give the Germans tools. If you give them the tools to do well, they can and will do well. Now, will it be an overnight change? Like, will the Germans instantly go from being like the worst nation in the game, win rate wise, to the top nation in the game? No, not by any means. But it will significantly improve their situation and allow players to be competitive at lower tiers and bring much better vehicles to a fight. Not to say that you can't just play 7.0 and get the same effect. because of the 7.7 black hole of matchmaking right now. But what I'm saying is that the Germans just need more tools that the other nations seem to always be getting, and the Germans seem to be getting none of. And that's why I was saying about the Panzer 58, the Panzer 61, and so on, from Switzerland, which offer like a sort of like a sort of transitional vehicle between the Panther 2 and the Leopard 1, and more Leopard 1 than Panther 2, but it's a nice smooth transition and would give the Germans more options.
Yeah, and I mean, it's sad to admit it, but I don't think that the German tanks will see any kind of stabilizer at 6.3 anytime soon. That also, or any kind of autoloader aside from the SPAAs, and also very very nice vehicles to drive for your occasional daily troll, like the M56 Scorpion. Like, it was ridiculously easy to just bypass any sort of combat, sneak around, and just be hidden because one bush covers your entire vehicle, and then just insert an APHE shell into the side of a Tiger 2, and then the next one, and the next one, and finally they see you. And when then they kill you, 3 or 4 of their tanks are already dead. And by that, the players are out, and you're already in a P-47 in the air, just knowing where your bomb's going to land, because by that time, a Tiger 2 just doesn't have the mobility to get out of the way. And that's kind of, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It repeats itself on and on and on. And yeah, it's time that Germany gets a bit more love by Gaijin. One problem, however, that I see with the down-tiering of vehicles is that then German vehicles add some sort of compression problem. And so it leads to the ultimate solution. I know this is dangerous to say as a German, but we need a complete battle rating overhaul from 4.0 and up. That's what we really need. And we need to de-stress it. And we need a bit more separation from post-war stuff that really makes Second World War stuff obsolete. I give you an example of a tank that I don't mind, and that is the MX-30 1972, because that heat shell is very bad. The reload is nothing highly unusual, and the mobility is nothing outstanding, and it doesn't have a stabilizer. And it's a new vehicle, but I think the heat shell damage output is way too low. And then we have vehicles such as the MX-50 Foch, and if you think about it, this is in every single way a better Jagdtiger than the Jagdtiger. It has better armor, better mobility, better gun with a high rate of fire, equal post-penetration damage effect, and is just absurdly mobile. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, I agree. The idea that the MX-50 Foch was a 7.3 when they introduced it into the tech tree, I was sitting there with my mouth open going, are you kidding me? The Foch is probably one of the best tier 5 tank destroyers in the game, I would say. Just straight up, it's better than anything else. And I'm saying that not only because it's got armor, it's got great penetration, but because it combines all that with exceptional mobility and maneuverability for such a large and heavy vehicle, something that a Jagdtiger could only dream of. This vehicle does everything a Jagdtiger could do way better. It also doesn't help that the 128mm post penetration damage, as of the last couple of years, has been getting worse and worse and worse and worse for some ungodly reason.
Yeah, for example, it always is very lovely if you finally manage to point your gun at a tank, you shoot him through the turret, and then 780 grams of TNT equivalent go off, massive shell, massive HE filler, big kinetic energy, and it kills the commander and the gunner, and the loaders on the other side of the gun bridge are like, what's up? It's ridiculous, especially since the 120mm solid AP shot goes through and just empties the entire turret. That's kind of that the Jagdtiger has no advantage whatsoever anymore. And in the times of mobility, it's just hopeless to drive it. Once the Jagdtiger was the gold standard, the embodiment of being overpowered. Now it's just it's a Jagdtiger, you know. And this is one of my greatest fears, that one of the or some of the most iconic tanks in the game that people really go for, you know, hoping for the best, to, I guess, not being overpowered, but, you know, making them work. I mean, it's just a sweet feeling to sit in a Tiger 2 and to just blast something like a kilometer away. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a T-34-85, you know, but to just be able to destroy something while your armor matters for the trade-off of having no mobility. And the Germans don't have this anymore. This is gone. There are so many more vehicles by now that also surpass the former gold standard. The upper frontal plate of the Tiger 2 is worth not too much anymore, and I'm not even beginning to talk about vehicles such as the Object 268 or the Object 120 or the Object 906, which is a 7.0 light tank that has no hull break, has a 6.0 reload for what's basically a long 88 with the option of firing 300 penetrating heat shells, and, you know, is even, you know, able to float on water. So good Soviet balance, you know, and the Germans have nothing like that, and it's
nothing comes close. I mean, the Object 906 is probably the pinnacle of what a light tank could be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit overkill, you know. I mean, I always was kind of, I mean, I was kind of always skeptical that any sort of light tank should be capable of taking on any sort of tank from the front. I mean, what is armor worth then? Nothing. But, you know, something like the Tiger 2 is by no means overpowered, yet people complain about it in their AMX 13s that they can't fight Tiger 2s head on, except the premium version, which has, you know, 4 rockets that I mean, it's just funny when you read through comments or you participate in a hot discussion and all this stuff is going around, you know, and people just are kind of, I don't want to use here harsh words, but they are narrow-minded because they're just looking from one nation's perspective at a certain problem. And if you ask Soviet tankers, they complain about certain stuff, you know, maybe the British complain about this and that. And, you know, the British are not flawless. I mean, they don't have too many mobile tanks at higher tiers, but at least they can artificially up-tier something that has mobility. And their stabilizers and their APDS, high rate of fire, and later on the Hesh, despite being nerfed, you know, it still kind of works against Panthers and Leopards. So there is still a lot of potential for the British. The only nation that I have consistently problems of fighting head-on at any tier, at any battle rating, are the Soviets, and yet they complain that their armor is worth nothing. And this is kind of a bit of weird because it is not really reflected in the stats or when I drive my Soviet tanks.
Right. I mean, the Soviets are fine for the most part. Now, where they do struggle at Tier 4 is the fact that they just don't have a real 6.7 lineup. It's like you jump from 6.3 to 7.0, and that's just kind of how it goes with the Soviet vehicles, unless you've got a couple of premiums to throw at it. And even then, they're not exactly ideal. You're either getting the worst of the lot, or you're getting the best of the lot. There's no middle ground there. Whereas the Germans,
you know, it always. Yeah, it happened to be that the IS-2 mod 1944, you know, had the luck because its post-war shell that really was not that necessary, if we are honest here, got removed, and it got benefited with a lower battle rating for it. And, you know, it's kind of fine for the IS-2. But if you then jump to the 7.0, or let's say the 7.3 meta, those tanks are fine for their battle rating, yet they drag up everything below that, you know. And if you fight constantly something like the SU-122-54 or the Object Nano 6 Type 62 with the heat shell after the community complaint, T-54s, various different variants in your tanks that are just not good enough to deal with it, with their trollish armor and their very reliable guns. It's just programmed that you kind of have a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a no-win situation for the Germans in either case, and the fact that they get dragged up and then they don't have anything to really compensate for being dragged up. And again, some of these vehicles, IS-6 is a perfect example. The only vehicle in the German lineup at 6.7 that can deal with an IS-6 from the front is an RU-251. So you have to spend money to kill money.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's pay to win, but it's pay to be competitive.
It's pay to be competitive, and that's not how you balance your game. It's not a good way for the consumer to balance your game. But since when has Gaijin cared that much about the consumer? So yeah, I think overall there are a few things that can be done to the Germans. One, lower some of the battle ratings, or do a complete battle rating overhaul of tiers 3 to 6 completely. Just scrap everything and start from scratch. That I think that would also help. Maybe some improvements. I don't know about improvements with CAS, because I think that's sort of a defining characteristic of the Germans. In the fact that their CAS isn't particularly good, but they do have some other potential options out there to maybe give them some extra added capabilities. More light tanks for the Germans. Dropping the Panther II down to 6.7 I think would really help them a lot. Just give the Germans the tools to succeed. Right now, the composition of their teams simply does not allow them to succeed. Not in today's meta, not in the way that the game is played right now. Also, removing conquest and domination modes, I think, would go a long way to help improving all the balancing for all the nations, because really the only nation that benefits from that mode is Russia, because they have the tanks that are best suited to get in close and deal damage. Like America can also kind of benefit from that, but really an assault is really where Russia shines. Whereas all of the other nations kind of do better on the defense. And you could also make the point that almost any tank would do better on the defense. But there are a few nations especially that focus a lot on the defense. I think the French are actually pretty good on the attack. Not simply because their vehicles are just very mobile, have great firepower. The British are more defensively oriented. The Americans are more defensively oriented. The Japanese and the Italians are just outliers. Why they're even there, nobody knows. Improving the team matchups, so like why the Japanese are being matched up with the Allies, like that doesn't make any sense. Why the French are being matched up with the Russians against the Germans, or with the Germans against everybody else, kind of doesn't really make any sense. Fixing that would go a long way, I think. There's just small things here and there would really go a long way to, well, not make the Germans anywhere near to the, not bring the Germans anywhere near to the level that they used to be, but bring them to a level where they're at least acceptable, at least fun to play. At the end of the day, this is all about fun. And if the Germans are a competitive nation and they're fun to play and it's worth getting through those tech trees, more people are going to play them, more people are going to spend money on the game, and it helps the community overall.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple truth that something does not have to be true to influence your opinion on something, and it's just about a feeling. And when you play Germany, you don't feel competitive. You feel like being held back. You're feeling inferior, and it is how it is. A lot of people, identify their national pride with what they are driving. And I'm not saying that everybody that is driving a German tank is a Nazi. I mean, there are always black sheeps. I mean, how many communists are driving the glorious Soviet tanks? You know, it's always how you look at it. But to go back to the reality, you drive something that is German because you have heard the German tanks were good in the Second World War and so forth, and you just think, oh, they might be competitive in the game. I'm a beginner, I need the advantage, you know, let's go in. And then they just get ruffle stomped really hard from so many aspects on the game, not just power creep, but enemy players being not just better, but also having better equipment suited for the task. And, you know, the funny thing is, Gaijin actually gave the Germans a bit of CAS support in the last 1.5 years. The latest addition, and this is very funny, is if you look at a plane called the Me-410 B1/U2, it now has 4 Werfergranaten 21. Those are one of the strongest rockets in the game, even rivaling the Tiny Tims. And guess what? You bloody cannot aim with them, because they shoot like 10 degrees, 15 degrees upwards from the wing, which is hilarious. So this plane, having somewhat limited CAS potential on paper, is utterly useless. And the cannon CAS is also very dangerous if you have to dive on your target and then try to pull out in a plane that just doesn't want to do that. And you pancake very often in your DOR 335s, in your TAR 152C3, and even the Heinkel 219A7, again a premium, has its difficulties, and the duck is just way too slow and just one of the most favorable targets for enemy SPA. Yeah, so that is it for this point, and it's just, you know, if you say that CAS is not important, you clearly never have played the British, even before or even after the rocket nerf, because, you know, they still have bombs.
Yeah, bombs haven't changed all too much. Yeah, you do have to get them closer to a target than you used to be, which is good. But even if you're halfway average at dive bombing, which really isn't that difficult to do once you get a little practice, you can drop bombs. You can basically put bombs right up stovepipes without really that much of an issue, and bombs will kill a tank. So I think that pretty much covers everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, so Germany has problems, and it's undeniable, and yeah, Gaijin should give them a bit of love. Rework of the flight models, battle rating changes, up-tiering other nations' tanks that are, you know, already damaging for the entire meta, but especially against Germany, they have a field day. And people complain about, you know, post-war stuff or Cold War era fighting against Second World War tanks. And it's not so much a problem that this is the case, as the Germans just have basically Second World War stuff, and everything that goes into Cold War area, as we just have discussed, is just not that easy to use, has a massive stock grind, and is easily be countered. And that kind of sums it up again for the tank section. There was something that I wanted to say, but I can't remember. So, do you have something to say?
Not really. I think we pretty much covered almost every aspect of this. It's simple solutions here, people. We're not trying to. We're not trying to change the rotation of the Earth here. All we're doing is just asking that Gaijin take this sort of thing into account. Or take these solutions into account. It's dropping some battle ratings, moving some vehicles around. Small things yeah, is all we're asking for. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here.
Yeah.
And
the funny part is, yeah, the funny part is Germany actually just got another buff, and that was with the Ersatz-M10 or the Panther M10, whatever you want to call it. And when you look at the stats, it's kind of again the same pattern. It's a rare event vehicle. Not a lot of people will have it. Even less will play it like in a year, where a lot of people switch to other game modes such as RRP, for example, or they try out different nations. But this tank, compare it with the Panther D, that is also the same battle rating in Tech 3 game version, it has much better turret traverse of 20 degrees per second, whereas the Panther D has struggles to get like 6 degrees per second. So that's a huge difference. Three times the turret traverse. Then also it has a bit of additional armor, which might be not the biggest change. However, it also has a stronger engine with the same weight at the same battle rating. So I'm just saying it's again another example. And by the way, the same goes for the British, funnily enough, because they have no real light tank to scout, with the scouting mechanic, which they really need some additional buff as well. I have to admit it, if you go with the fairness, you have to admit that the British kind of lack the light tanks and the scout mechanic. And the AEC Mark II is the first British vehicle that actually can scout. So...
Again,
this is how you do it.
Premium.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, the British, I don't think anybody will argue, however, that the British are not competitive. I was saying from day one that the British were introduced that they were the most competitive nation in the game. And it was really only a matter of time until people realized that. But the British do lack an in-game light tank. Now, whether or not that is because they just didn't develop any is a completely different issue. However, I generally don't find it's that much of a problem for the British. The British can still win games. It's more difficult for them now, ever since the APDS and Hesh got nerfed, especially. But they can still win games. It is possible. So
yeah, especially with the AP buff, I've tried it out with the FE4 202. One of the most balanced tanks, and I found myself very often just using the stock AP round because of the greater post penetration damage that is equal to the French, and which is very, very good, and you just could do tremendous amounts of damage even through the straight front of German tanks. There is no doubt about that. And if you really run across something that is heavily armored, like for example a Tiger II, you even can shoot through the lower plate with APDS and bypass the transmission, So again, this is something that a lot of people do not even know. However, for example, the British have still, again, something like the Cromwell that has 600 horsepower for a 27-ton tank. So over 20 horsepower per ton ratio. And again, it can flank. If it's very effective with that gun, that battle rating in a 7.0 battle, I kind of doubt, but it is how it is. It's not as if the British, really, really struggle. The times where AP did no damage are gone. The APDS on the 20-pounder is still very strong. The L7 issue is there. However, the British have a stabilizer and a faster reload than, for example, the German Leopard, which doesn't have Hesh by default. And so that also has a higher battle rating. So it's always a struggle that the Germans have go through. It's always those little things and another little thing, then a big thing, and the advantages are just there on paper or in theory or just with very, very good team play, which, the people that are dedicated to very competitive gameplay, aka stat padders, they just play other nations and just don't care about Germany anymore. And this is not how it should be with one of the most famous tank nations aside the Russians.
Right. For all their reputation, they don't seem to live up to it at all in War Thunder, which is sad. At least not anymore. And that's
at this point in time, I think we should end it because guess how long we're talking? Like an hour.
Yeah, I think so too. I think this is a good point to wrap up at.
Yeah. So thank you for having a talk. It was a pleasure. We covered a lot of stuff. I guess people will use this as some sort of podcast. Feel free to do so, at least on my part. And yeah, that's it for me. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, so see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
So this part is now again after the, well, rambling that we both had, and you also will find probably a video the next few days about this stuff on Miles' YouTube channel. Link will be in the video description, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I will probably do this once or twice per month. Maybe not as regular as I'd like to, but I think it is a good video format. Again, I'm very looking forward to your comments in the comment section, and also that you people hit the like button. And yeah, the background footage, I try to just give you some examples throughout the different nations, and yeah, let's see how it goes. Then that's it finally for me after 1 hour and 10 minutes. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Again, please give this video a like if you did, subscribe if you wanna see more of this kind of video, and we'll see each other in the skies and on the battlefields of War Thunder.